He once dug wells to buy insulin for his dying mother. But one night under the desert sky, he wrote something in chalk that would one day hold a drop of water still in a storm. The desert in southern Arizona does not forgive easily. It remembers every drought, every vanished river, every promise broken by the sky. In the town of Ajo, water was not just a resource. It was a rumor. And for 16-year-old Elías Moreno, it was everything. By day, he dug. Not metaphorically, not poetically. He dug wells, with his hands. Long, blistered fingers, rusted shovels, a worn-out auger he borrowed from a neighbor who no longer believed in luck. The sun beat down on his neck as if trying to burn out the last of his youth. Elías had dropped out of school 2 years earlier when his mother's kidneys began to fail. She needed insulin. She needed clean water. Arizona offered neither. At night, Elías sat alone near the mouth of a dry well, not to rest, but to think. He brought with him a stick of chalk and a broken piece of wood, a salvaged cabinet door he used as a makeshift board. And there, beneath stars that shimmered like equations half solved, he wrote down strange symbols he had copied from an old textbook. The book had been burned around the edges, but the title was still visible. Introduction to Fluid Dynamics. He'd found it near a junk pile behind the library. Elías didn't fully understand what he was reading. But the way the book described water, not just as a liquid, but as a system of movement, force, and pressure, fascinated him. There was one particular idea he couldn't let go of. It was called the Navier-Stokes problem. It asked a simple question. When liquid moves, under what conditions will its flow remain smooth? And when will it break apart into chaos? That night, the desert wind whispered over the sand. His younger sister Clara was asleep in their trailer, one hand wrapped around a plastic cup of melted ice. Their mother had been taken to a clinic 2 towns away. He hadn't heard anything in days, so he dug by day. And when he couldn't dig, he wrote. On his wooden board, he scribbled a strange thought. It was about pressure. What if, instead of letting the pressure push out in all directions, he shaped it, like a cone? What if he forced the energy of the water inward, narrowed it, contained it, like holding a whirlpool in the palm of your hand? He drew a rough sketch, a funnel-shaped tunnel with water twisting through it but never exploding. Underneath, he wrote in Spanish, "Water doesn't die, it only loses its shape." 2 miles away, a van from Caltech rolled into the desert. A group of graduate students had come to Ajo to study water shortages. One of them, a PhD student named Jonah Feld, wandered off from the group. He liked taking pictures of strange, forgotten things. That night, he snapped a photo of a wooden board leaning against a well. The board was covered in chalk lines, diagrams, arrows, words about energy and flow. He thought it was nothing. Maybe a construction worker playing around. He didn't know he had just taken a picture of a boy's quiet genius. The next day, Elías got a call. It was the nurse. His mother had gone into shock. There wasn't enough insulin. The clinic couldn't save her. She had asked for him once, then closed her eyes. Elías didn't scream. He didn't cry. He stood in the backyard holding his shovel, dirt clinging to his hands, the sun burning overhead. Then he walked back to the well. He erased his notes from the board. Slowly, he wrote something new. It was an idea he'd seen in the textbook, called an energy estimate. It meant this: even in chaotic motion, energy cannot grow forever. Something always slows it down. He stared at the board and whispered to himself, if energy can't grow forever, maybe grief can't either. He didn't know if it was true, but he needed to believe it. Back at Caltech, Jonah's photo reached the desk of Professor Elias Hoffman, a senior researcher in mathematics. He studied the picture for a long time. Then he turned to his assistant and asked, "Who drew this?" The assistant shook his head. "No name. Just a location, Ajo, Arizona." Hoffman looked again at the way the boy had shaped the force lines, how he had drawn the pressure funnel. "Whoever wrote this," Hoffman whispered, "understands turbulence better than most graduate students I've taught." In Ajo, Elias sat by the dry well again. The air was still. His sister was quiet, their trailer darker than usual. But he brought the board back out, not for anyone else, for himself. He asked questions out loud as if the desert might answer. What keeps water from flying apart? Why does pressure break before motion? If movement is energy, then what is stillness? A few weeks later, a letter came from Caltech. It was handwritten. "We saw your work. It matters. If you wish, we can offer you a place to study, any level you like. Professor E. Hoffman." Elias read it, then folded it gently and tucked it inside his mother's Bible. He didn't reply. Instead, that night he went back to the well. He drew a circle on the ground with chalk, and inside it he wrote, "Let me hold one shape, just long enough to understand why it breaks." Above him, the stars blinked cold and clear. But in his chest, something warm had begun to stir. It had been 5 nights since Elias folded the letter from Caltech and placed it inside his mother's Bible. He hadn't told anyone about it. Not Clara, not the neighbor who sometimes brought them canned soup, not even the wind that rattled the trailer walls at night. He had gone back to the well each evening, same as always, but something was different now. There was no longer anyone to dig for, no one waiting inside for clean water, no mother counting his calloused fingers as proof of her son's love. And yet, the well still called to him, not for work, for questions. That night, the desert air was colder than usual. Elias lit the old camping lantern, propped it against a bucket, and unrolled the canvas that he used as a mat. On top of it, he placed the wooden board. A new piece of chalk in his hand, cracked but dry. He stared at the board for a long while. The wind blew soft. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out once, then fell silent. Elias finally leaned forward and wrote one sentence, slowly. "If energy collapses, what holds its shape?" He stared at the words, not elegant, not technical, but honest. He remembered something from the burned textbook. The author had said, "When you cannot solve the equation, estimate the behavior. Find the edge where things fall apart." He thought about that. The edge. What was the edge of water? Of motion? Of life? Maybe, he thought. Maybe the answer wasn't in the formulas. Maybe it was in how they broke down. So he began to draw. Not numbers this time. Shapes. Circles collapsing into spirals. Lines curling into vortexes. A droplet of water pulled in 2 directions at once, by pressure on one side and velocity on the other. He whispered to the chalkboard, "You don't have to be perfect. Just don't disappear." Far away in Pasadena, Professor Hoffman had not forgotten the photo from Ajo. He kept it pinned to the edge of his whiteboard, just above a long list of failed approaches to the Navier-Stokes problem. One morning, while preparing slides for a graduate seminar, he paused. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but his mind was elsewhere. The funnel shape, the collapsed pressure path, the sentence in Spanish, translated loosely by his assistant. "Water doesn't die, it only loses its shape." He murmured to himself, "That's not mathematics. That's poetry in the language of motion." For the first time in years, the professor found himself curious again. Not about answers, but about how someone so far from academia could think so precisely, so intuitively. He opened a new folder on his computer and labeled it Moreno Notes. He had a feeling the boy wasn't done writing. Back in Arizona, Elias began waking earlier. He still worked. He still took small jobs, clearing weeds, fixing old fences. The money was barely enough for gas and rice, but every evening he returned to the well, not to dig, to study. He had borrowed a geometry textbook from the mobile library that came once a month. It was bent, faded, but complete. Elias read it front to back, twice. That was when he made a connection that startled him. In the textbook, there was a chapter on convergence, the idea that even if a shape keeps changing, it can still settle toward a final form, like a spiral curling inward, like grief. He went back to his board and wrote, "If the flow doesn't stay smooth, can it still settle?" Then, underneath, even a broken river reaches the sea. He began to sense a pattern. He didn't know the right names for it. No one had ever taught him functional spaces or smoothness classes, but he could feel the tension in the problem. There was a fight going on inside the water, between its speed and its shape, between what it wanted to do and what it was allowed to do. He thought of his mother's body, how it had tried to keep going, even as her blood slowed, even as her kidneys whispered no. Maybe, he thought, her body was like the water, turbulent, exhausted, but still flowing until it couldn't. One evening he wrote again on the board, this time with a steadier hand. He drew a long horizontal line and wrote next to it, "Energy over time." Then a curve, dipping gently downward, like a falling leaf. Loss through friction. Then a question mark. What stops the collapse? He stared at that final phrase for a long time. What stops the collapse? Not just of fluids, of families, of hope, of people. He didn't know, but he wanted to. The next day, something unexpected happened. While Elias was buying milk at the corner store, the man at the register handed him an envelope. "No return address," the man said. "Looks official." Elias opened it slowly. Inside was a printed note from Caltech. "We respect your silence, but we'd like to offer a different path. If travel is not possible, would you be willing to send us your notes? We will treat them with care. Learning belongs to everyone. E. Hoffman." Elias folded the letter. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. But something inside him steadied. He went home, opened a clean notebook, and began copying the chalkboard diagrams carefully by hand. Not because he wanted recognition, because someone had listened. That night, he sat beside the well and looked up at the stars. He thought about his mother, how she used to hum softly when she stirred soup, how she'd ask him what he'd learned that day. Even when he had nothing to say, he whispered aloud, "I'm still learning, Mama. I'm trying to hold it all together, like water in my hands." The wind passed over him like a sigh. The chalk in his hand felt warm, and in the dark, the equation on the board looked almost like a prayer. Elias didn't know the notebook he mailed to California would cause a stir. He wrapped it carefully in brown paper, tied with string, and mailed it from the gas station post office, using the last $8 in his wallet. Inside were 34 pages, diagrams, questions, and quiet insights, all written in the same steady pencil-marked hand. He didn't expect an answer. He wasn't even sure someone would read it. But 700 miles away, inside a quiet office at Caltech, Professor Elias Hoffman sat in silence, turning each page like it was something sacred. There were no proofs, no theorems, but there was something rarer, intuitive structure. Elias had taken pieces of fluid motion that researchers had struggled with for decades and drawn them as if they were memories from his own life. He didn't try to tame turbulence. He listened to it. At the bottom of page 17, he had written, "I don't want to solve the storm. I want to understand why it begins. Hoffman whispered to himself, "This boy sees the wind the way a musician hears silence." He didn't send a reply. He sent a student. Jonah Feld stepped off the bus in Ajo 3 days later. He was tall, wiry, and slightly sunburned before noon. He carried a small backpack, a camera, and one name, Elías Moreno. He asked around town, quietly. The librarian knew. So did the store clerk. "You'll find him by the old dry well behind the trailer homes," someone said. "He's always out there with a board and some chalk like he's drawing for the sky." When Jonah found him, Elías didn't look up right away. He was drawing something in the dirt with a stick, a large circle with ripples radiating outward, like a stone dropped into still water. Beside it, a broken piece of wood with worn chalk lines. Jonah stood quietly, watching. Elías finally glanced up, brushing dust from his hands. "You're not from here." Jonah smiled. "No, I'm from Pasadena." Elías looked back down. "They sent you." "They didn't tell me to come," Jonah said softly. "I asked." Silence. Then Elías said, "Did you understand it?" Jonah knelt beside him. "Not all of it, but enough to know it matters." Elías drew another line in the sand, pointing. "This ripple here, it starts small. Then it spreads and spreads, but at the edge," he tapped the outer line. "It doesn't vanish. It whispers back." Jonah furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" Elías stood and walked a few paces away. Then he cupped his hands, mimicking the shape of a funnel. When water collapses in a space that's too small, it echoes. It folds in on itself. That's where energy either breaks apart or finds something new. Jonah was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You talk like the math is alive." Elías shrugged. "Sometimes I think it is." They spent the afternoon drawing in the sand. Jonah asked questions. Elías answered slowly, sometimes in words, sometimes in sketches. He explained how he saw the balance between force and resistance not as a calculation, but like a dance, each motion pulling or yielding, searching for rest. He explained why he believed not every violent flow meant chaos. "Some storms," he said, "don't destroy. They reshape." Jonah asked him why he never returned the offer to study at Caltech. Elías looked toward the horizon, where the desert blurred into heat. "I buried my mother last month," he said quietly. "There's no one left to take care of Clara." Jonah nodded. "But you could learn more." "I am learning," Elías said. That evening, Jonah followed him back to the trailer. It was small, faded, but clean. Clara sat at the kitchen table drawing flowers on a torn cereal box. "This is my sister," Elías said simply. Clara looked up and smiled with a kind of shyness that came from losing too much, too young. Elías poured 2 cups of instant coffee. They sat on the front steps as the sun dropped. Jonah said, "Professor Hoffman asked if I thought you'd ever want to come to campus." Elías didn't answer for a long time. Then quietly he said, "Maybe one day, but only if I can bring the desert with me." Jonah laughed softly. "You mean Clara?" Elías shook his head. "I mean the way it teaches. The way the wind never shouts but still moves mountains. The way dry earth waits for water, not demanding, just listening." Later that night, Jonah slept on an old cot near the window. He watched as Elías pulled out the wooden board and began writing again by lantern light. This time, Jonah saw the difference. There was structure now, lines that curved into meaning, sections that resembled the way researchers spoke of pressure decay and containment thresholds. But more than that, There was something human in the flow. Jonah reached for his notebook and began writing. He doesn't fight the equation. He follows it. Like a river. He doesn't prove. He listens. Before dawn, Elias stepped outside. The sky was purple with the first breath of morning. He looked at the well, the same well he had dug for years. He walked toward it slowly. Then, using his last piece of chalk, he wrote one sentence on the wood. Flow remembers its origin. He stood for a long time, listening. Not to the wind, to what lay beneath it. The whisper inside the flow. The morning after Jonah left, Elias wrapped the wooden board in a towel and placed it inside an old suitcase. He'd never mailed wood before, but it didn't feel like mailing wood. It felt like mailing part of himself. Inside the suitcase, he also tucked a stack of notes, pages copied neatly by hand, diagrams drawn in pencil, every arrow measured and careful. On the final page, he wrote a single line in Spanish. Este no es un intento, es una pregunta. This is not a solution, it's a question. Then he closed the suitcase, wrapped it in tape, and carried it 2 miles to the post office under the heat of noon. He paid for shipping with a folded envelope of tips he had saved from hauling scrap metal. 3 days later, in a quiet seminar room at Caltech, Professor Hoffman opened the suitcase. He did not speak. He unwrapped the board slowly, reverently, like something fragile. Behind him, 4 graduate students watched in silence. Among them was Jonah, still tired from travel but wide-eyed. The drawings on the board were strange. Hand-drawn grids, arrows that curved inward instead of out. Words scribbled not in technical terms, but in human ones. Soft turbulence. Energy memory. Collapse boundary. Hold. Don't break. One student, a tall, sharp-faced man named Derek Curthers, narrowed his eyes. "This is beautiful," he said flatly. "But it's not math." Hoffman glanced at him. "It's something better," the professor replied. "It's insight." Over the next 2 weeks, Hoffman began quietly translating Elias's notes into formal language, turning the sketches into expressions, the arrows into estimates. He didn't change the heart of the work, only its coat. He didn't tell anyone, yet. He wanted to understand it first. There was something in Elias's drawings that felt different. Like standing in front of a mirror that didn't show your face, but showed how you were feeling. One night, he sat at his desk long past midnight, staring at a diagram Elias had labeled the holding pattern. It showed a flow, violent, twisting, unstable, suddenly calming inside a conic space. The energy didn't vanish. It shifted. It curved into stillness. Hoffman whispered aloud, "He's not solving turbulence. He's asking it to stay." Meanwhile, in Ajo, Elias kept studying. The mobile library had returned. This time, he borrowed a book on functional spaces, the kind mathematicians use to describe rough, imperfect functions. He didn't understand most of it. But one chapter spoke to him. The idea that a function didn't have to be smooth everywhere to exist. It could be broken in places, incomplete, but still real. He whispered the sentence aloud. It doesn't have to be perfect to hold together. That night, Clara curled beside him on the mattress, holding a flashlight while he copied notes. "Why do you stay up so late?" she asked sleepily. Elias smiled. "Because water doesn't sleep." Back at Caltech, word of Hoffman's secret work had begun to spread. Not publicly. Not yet. But whispers floated in hallways that he was studying a set of strange notes from someone outside. Someone not published. Someone without credentials. One morning, Derek Curthers stepped into Hoffman's office unannounced. "You're risking your name on a janitor's drawings," he said coldly. "Why?" Hoffman didn't look up. "Because those drawings see things we don't." Curthers crossed his arms. "And what happens when it turns out they're meaningless? A child's fantasy? You'll look like a man who mistook poetry for proof." Hoffman finally looked at him. "Sometimes," he said. "Poetry gets there first." That evening, Curthers requested to review the notebook himself. Hoffman agreed reluctantly. He handed over a copy with one warning: judge the ideas, not the hands that wrote them. Curthers said nothing, but inside, he had already decided. He didn't want the ideas to work. He wanted to protect the walls of the world he had spent a decade climbing. The next day, Elias received a letter. Not from Hoffman, from someone else at Caltech. Cold, professional. "We have reviewed your diagrams. At present, they do not meet the standards of formal academic submission. Your intuition is noted, but lacks sufficient rigor. We thank you for your interest. Department Review Board." Elias read it twice. He folded it slowly, placed it on the table, and sat very still. Clara looked up. "Is something wrong?" Elias shook his head gently. "No, nothing's wrong." But that night, he didn't write. He just sat beside the well, staring into the dark. 2 nights later, another envelope arrived. This one was handwritten. Inside was a single sentence from Professor Hoffman. "Don't stop now. The storm is listening." Enclosed was a page with typed notes, refinements, corrections, careful questions, and at the bottom, "You've built a function that holds. Even if the world doesn't see it yet, I do." Elias read the words, then read them again. Then he reached for his notebook, opened to a blank page, and wrote, "The function doesn't need to be smooth. It only needs to carry the weight." That night he went to the well again. He stood for a long time in the dark. Then, with quiet hands, he chalked one new sentence onto the board. "Even if no one believes the water holds, the water still remembers how." The chalk line was crooked. The letters were rough, but they were still there, steady in the night. The seminar room at Caltech's Department of Applied Mathematics was rarely full. Graduate students came and went with notebooks and coffee. Postdocs sat in the back, half listening while correcting problem sets. Professors sometimes showed up late, sometimes not at all. But on this Tuesday afternoon, every seat was taken. Word had gotten around. Professor Hoffman was presenting something new. Something quietly important, as one student put it. Something not from inside the department. Whispers had turned into questions. Was it a new model? A new approach to turbulence? A rumor claimed it came from a boy in the desert. No one believed it. Not really. But everyone showed up. Professor Hoffman entered 5 minutes late, his usual pace calm, unbothered. He carried no laptop, just a stack of printed pages and something tucked under his arm, a weathered piece of wood. He set it down gently on the chalkboard ledge, then turned to face the room. "I'm not going to give a formal talk," he said. Murmurs stirred. "I'm going to show you a question," he continued, "posed by someone outside this university, outside this country almost." He held up a single diagram, curved lines, flow fields bending inward. At the bottom, one phrase, handwritten, "Collapse without breaking." "This," Hoffman said softly, "was drawn by a 16-year-old in Arizona. No degree, no training. Just hunger." A ripple of silence passed through the room. Then a voice from the back, measured, skeptical. "Is this a thought experiment or a joke?" Professor Hoffman looked up. "No, this is a framework. It may not be written in our language, but the structure is there. He turned to the board and began to draw, slow, precise strokes. He translated Elias's sketches into smooth lines. Flow curvature. Boundary containment. Not equations, but ideas. Their skeletons. This model, he explained, suggests a method of redirecting energy in collapsing flows by shaping the dissipation zone. The goal is not to solve Navier-Stokes directly, but to propose a holding function, one that prevents energy from tearing itself apart. He paused. In simpler terms, he asks the chaos to stay, not by force, by form. A student near the front raised her hand. But where is the rigor? The definitions? They're coming, Hoffman said. I'm working on that. But what he gave us wasn't a solution. It was an intuition. And sometimes, that's where breakthroughs begin. Another student leaned forward. What's the author's name? Hoffman's chalk stopped mid-line. He turned slowly, then said, His name is Elías Moreno. He works nights. He lives in a desert town called Ajo. He digs wells. He lost his mother last month. He sent me this in a box wrapped in a towel. A pause. He is not a PhD. He is not a professor. But he listens to turbulence better than any of us. The room went quiet. For once, even Curthers, arms crossed, always unimpressed, said nothing. But his silence wasn't agreement. It was calculation. Then, after a long moment, he spoke. You're basing a research direction on someone with no academic record. Hoffman didn't flinch. I'm basing it on the clarity of his insight. Curthers tilted his head. Insight without theory is guesswork. No, Hoffman replied. It's how theory begins. After the seminar, students gathered in small circles. Some were intrigued, some embarrassed. Others whispered about standards and credibility. But a few stayed late. Among them was Laia Tran, a quiet postdoc known for her careful thinking. She approached the board where Hoffman had left the diagram. This flow curvature, she murmured, tracing the shape with her eyes. It's not standard, but it reminds me of something in the bounded vorticity papers from the 80s. She turned to Hoffman. Has anyone tried mapping it against real data? He smiled. You're the first person to ask that. Back in Idaho, Elias knew none of this. He was walking home from the auto shop where he'd helped change tires for 3 hours. Clara ran beside him, holding a paper fan she'd made in school. Can we draw tonight? She asked. Elias smiled, tired. You always ask. And you always say yes, she replied. That evening they sat beside the well again. Clara drew flowers in the dirt. Elias opened his notebook. He didn't know his name had been spoken in a room full of scholars. He didn't know his diagrams were now on 3 whiteboards at Caltech. He only knew the desert was quiet, and his pencil still worked. 3 days later, a small package arrived at the Ajo post office. The woman behind the counter handed it to him carefully. Inside, a USB drive, a stack of printed pages, and a short note. Elias, you gave us the sketch. Now we're giving it back, with structure. Several of us at Caltech are working through your ideas. They're holding together. I'd like to propose something. A remote seminar. Just a small group. No pressure. Only learning. No one will know but us. You belong, even from far away. Hoffman. Elias held the letter in both hands. He didn't speak. Clara looked up from the table. Is it good news? Elias nodded, then whispered, I think the flow didn't break. That night he wrote a sentence at the top of a fresh page. Maybe a function can hold the weight of silence, too. And for the first time in weeks, He smiled as he wrote. The morning of the seminar, Elias rose early. The desert light hadn't yet touched the sky. Clara was still asleep, curled beneath a quilt made of old t-shirts. Elias moved quietly, careful not to wake her. On the kitchen table sat the loaned laptop. The librarian had given it to him 3 days ago. An old machine, a little slow but still breathing. The screen flickered when it started, like it wasn't sure if it should trust the power inside. Elias understood the feeling. He had spent the last 2 nights reading through the notes Hoffman sent. His sketches had returned to him, transformed. Where once he had drawn lines with chalk and hope, now those lines carried names: bounded dissipation, soft collapse, energy persistence under asymmetric pressure. He didn't know what to say in a seminar. He had never been in one. But Hoffman's final line in the letter stayed with him. You don't have to sound like us. You only have to sound like you. At 9:57 a.m., he clicked the link. The screen opened with a small sound. Boop. Then, faces. 4 squares. One was Hoffman, calm, gray-bearded, and smiling. One was a woman with sharp eyes and soft voice, Dr. Leah Tron. One was a blank box labeled Derek Curthers. And the last, glowing faintly in the lower corner, was Elías Moreno. Hoffman spoke first. Elias, good morning. Can you hear us? Elias nodded. Yes, sir. You don't have to say sir, Hoffman chuckled. Here, you're a peer. That word, peer, landed heavily in Elias's chest. He wasn't sure if it was true, but he let it sit there. They began slowly. Hoffman reviewed one diagram, a familiar one to Elias. It showed a fluid spiraling inward, the edges of motion tightening instead of exploding. Elias called this the holding pattern, Hoffman said, tapping the screen. Leah, you ran this through your simulator. What did you find? Dr. Tran nodded. At high Reynolds numbers, the flow remains coherent longer than expected. It doesn't fully stabilize, but it resists fragmentation. She looked at Elias. It's not perfect, but it's promising. Elias leaned forward. It's because the pressure isn't resisting the motion, he said. It's moving with it. The way a wheel doesn't fight the road, it rolls. There was a brief silence, then a faint smile from Leah. Nicely said, she replied. Curthers unmuted his mic. His voice came through flat, professional. Elias, where did you learn this language of flow, these metaphors? Elias hesitated. I dug wells, for years. I watched how water moves through rock, how it listens to space before it fills it. Curthers' pause was long. Then, you understand this is not standard terminology. I know, Elias said quietly. Curthers continued. Do you know what a weak solution is? No, sir. A Sobolev space? No. Curthers leaned back in his chair. So we're using intuition without foundation. Hoffman spoke, calm but firm. We're not grading him. We're learning with him. The seminar continued. They moved to Elias's second sketch, the soft boundary, a zone where collapsing energy didn't vanish, but redistributed itself like folding fabric. Hoffman explained how, under certain constraints, this model could help approximate energy containment in turbulent systems. Then he turned to Elias. How did you come up with this structure? Elias thought for a moment. When my mother got sick, we didn't have enough insulin, so I tried to stretch what we had. Not stop the disease, just slow it, hold it in place long enough to rest. He looked directly at the screen. Turbulence is like that. You can't stop it. But sometimes, You can give it a shape to rest inside. No one spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then Dr. Tran said quietly, "This boy thinks in structure. He's not solving equations. He's listening to them." By the end of the hour, the seminar had shifted. Curthers remained skeptical but quieter. Elías had spoken 3 more times, each time slower but more certain. His voice trembled once, not from fear, from the weight of being heard. Before they ended, Hoffman looked into the camera. "Elías, would you be willing to present this model again, to a wider group?" Elías hesitated. "I'm not ready for that." Hoffman nodded. "Then we'll wait." But Dr. Tran leaned forward gently. "You're more ready than you think." After the call ended, Elías sat back in his chair. The trailer was quiet again. The desert outside buzzed with late morning heat. Clara peeked from the hallway. "Did you do your meeting?" He smiled. "Yeah." She stepped into the room holding a glass of water. "Did they like your pictures?" He nodded. She handed him the glass. "You should tell them you're good at water." Later that night, Elías returned to the well. He brought the laptop just to look at the diagrams again. Not for praise, for clarity. He opened a new page in his notebook. At the top, he wrote, "The shape doesn't fix the storm, but it gives it a place to pause." Then under it, a smaller line. "I think I'm learning how to hold too." He sat with the words a while, then closed the notebook, leaned back against the dry well, and whispered to the sky, "Thank you for listening." The invitation came as a quiet email. No subject line, just a few words. Proposal for publication, collaborative authorship. Elías didn't know what to make of it. He had never seen his name in print before, not even on a bill that wasn't overdue. He clicked the message open. Inside, Professor Hoffman explained that their team had been developing a paper based on his holding pattern model. The results, though preliminary, were remarkable. Fluid energy remained bounded longer than standard theory predicted. The paper would be submitted to the Journal of Fluid Mechanics. At the bottom of the message, Hoffman wrote, "I listed you as co-author. If you agree, the paper will go forward." Elías reread that line until the screen blurred. Co-author. The word felt heavy and unreal. He thought of his mother's voice long ago. "Keep learning, mijo, even if no one sees you." He smiled softly. Maybe someone finally did. A week later, the team met again online. This time there were more faces on the screen, 8 boxes instead of 4. New professors, editors, reviewers. Elías sat quietly, waiting for Hoffman to begin. But before the professor could speak, Derek Curthers cleared his throat. "I believe we should discuss naming conventions," he said briskly. "The current draft refers to the model as the Moreno function. I propose we rename it the Hoffman flow for clarity and continuity." A pause filled the room. Dr. Tran frowned. "Continuity or hierarchy?" Curthers didn't flinch. Let's be realistic. No journal will publish a paper crediting an untrained laborer as the originator of a theoretical model. We risk credibility. Elías said nothing. He looked down at his hands, rough and scarred, the same ones that had once dug through sand and stone. Hoffman's voice broke the silence. "You mean we risk pride?" Curthers' expression tightened. "I mean, Professor, that your generosity could cost you standing." "And your fear," Hoffman said quietly, "could cost us truth." The room went still. For the next hour, the discussion swirled like the flows they studied, arguments folding into counter-arguments, theory colliding with policy. One reviewer spoke gently. "Professor Hoffman, You must understand the precedent. Authorship carries responsibility. This boy, he's bright, yes, but he is not trained. Hoffman smiled faintly. Neither was Faraday when he walked into the Royal Institution with calloused hands. But this isn't the 1800s. Then maybe it's time we remembered what we forgot. Through the noise, Elias finally found his voice. He unmuted his mic. Please, he said softly, you don't have to use my name. The room quieted. He looked straight into the camera. I didn't draw for a name. I just wanted to understand why water holds for a moment before it breaks. If the model helps someone else see that, that's enough. His voice trembled, but not from fear, from the strange weight of humility, the kind that bends, not breaks. After the meeting ended, Hoffman called him privately. Elias, he said, you have to listen to me. What you did has worth. The name matters. Elias smiled tiredly. Names wash away, Professor. Equations stay. Hoffman shook his head. Maybe, but stories stay longer. He hesitated, then added, Do you remember what you wrote to me in your first notebook? Water doesn't die. It only loses its shape. Yes. That's you, Hoffman said. You gave shape to something none of us could hold. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Elias said quietly, If the paper goes forward, call it what you must. I'll keep learning. That's enough. 3 weeks later, the journal published the paper. On the persistence of energy in collapsing flows, the Hoffman flow model. Elias read the title twice. His name wasn't there, not even in the acknowledgments, but he read every line of the text anyway. In the section titled Conceptual Origin, there was a single sentence. The initial intuition for this framework was derived from an independent thinker outside the academic community, whose insights into physical behavior guided the earliest sketches of this model. That was all. No name, no story, just a shadow under a title. That night, Clara found him sitting by the well again. She was older now, 8, with her mother's dark eyes and quiet grace. Why are you sad? She asked. I'm not, he said. Just thinking. She sat beside him, hugging her knees. About your water drawings? He nodded. Did they like them? He smiled faintly. Enough to keep them. Then they're yours. He looked at her. How do you mean? If you make something and it helps people, it stays yours, even if they don't write your name. Because you still remember it. Elias laughed softly through his nose. You're wiser than most professors. She shrugged. I just listen like you do. Weeks passed. He went back to work at the garage, fixed engines, patched tires, replaced hoses that hissed like tired snakes. He still wrote at night. Notes about motion, air, sound, and sometimes just about memory. One evening he opened a letter from Hoffman. It contained only a single printed page. Elias. They changed the name, but not the truth. At next year's symposium, I'll tell them where it began. If you ever wish to stand beside me, there will be a chair waiting. E. Hoffman. At the bottom, in smaller handwriting, Water remembers. Elias folded the letter and slipped it between the pages of his mother's old Bible. He whispered, Maybe that's all that matters. Then he looked toward Clara, asleep at the table beside her homework, and smiled. Because in her eyes, and in the quiet persistence of every drop he'd ever tried to hold, his name still lived. The auditorium at Caltech had not been this crowded in years. Rows of professors, researchers, graduate students, journalists, all gathered for the annual Fluid Dynamics Symposium. The topic on the schedule was simple enough: recent advances in turbulent stability. but everyone knew why they had come. They wanted to hear Professor Elias Hoffman and his mysterious new model, the one that had unsettled the department, fascinated reviewers, and whispered of an unseen mind behind it all. Outside, the sky over Pasadena was calm and bright. Inside, the air trembled with quiet anticipation. At the front of the hall, Hoffman stood beside a clean chalkboard. He wore his oldest coat, the one he'd kept since his first lecture 30 years ago. On the ledge beside him lay a small wooden board wrapped in linen. He looked out at the crowd and began. "Good afternoon," he said softly. "Today I want to talk to you about motion that refuses to disappear, motion that holds, even when it should collapse." He drew a slow curve on the board. The model we call the Hoffman flow emerged from that question. But before we go into equations, I want to tell you how it was born. A ripple of surprise passed through the audience. Storytelling was not the norm here. He continued. Years ago, in the middle of the Arizona desert, a young man was digging wells. He had no degree, no lab, no funding. But he had one question, the same question we have all asked in our own way. Why does the world hold together when it should fall apart? He paused. On a small table beside him, he unwrapped the wooden board. Its surface was worn smooth, faint lines of chalk still clinging to it like memories. This, Hoffman said quietly, was the first sketch. He lifted it gently, turning it toward the audience. Some leaned forward. Others frowned, unsure what they were looking at. But the board had presence. Simple curves, hand-drawn arrows, a phrase written at the bottom in faded white. Collapse without breaking. Hoffman traced the phrase with his thumb. This was drawn by a boy named Elías Moreno. He sent it to me in a box wrapped in a towel. The room went utterly silent. In a small cafe in Ajo, Arizona, the radio crackled. Elias was wiping tables between customers when he heard it. A familiar voice, calm and low, echoing through static. He froze. Today, Hoffman's voice said, we correct the record. The old cafe owner, Mrs. Vega, turned the volume up. A few men looked up from their coffee. Elias sat down slowly at the counter, his hands trembling around a mug. Back in Pasadena, Hoffman kept speaking. For months, this young man worked alone. He studied the motion of water through sand, through air, through loss. He sent me sketches that spoke a language we had forgotten, a language where mathematics was not command but compassion, where the question was not how to control turbulence, but how to let it breathe without destroying itself. He turned to the board again. Here, he said. He saw that even chaos can carry memory. That energy, no matter how wild, tries to return to form. He called it the function that holds together. I call it grace. At the back of the hall, Dr. Laya Tran closed her laptop and listened. She had read hundreds of papers, attended hundreds of talks, but never had one made her heart ache. Curthers sat 3 rows away, his jaw tight. He didn't interrupt, not this time. Hoffman continued, voice steady. I have spent my life studying equations that refused to yield, but this young man, who once dug wells for his mother, showed me something my degrees could not, that the heart can sometimes see what the mind cannot calculate. He looked out at the audience, meeting every gaze. So I ask you to remember his name, not because he solved a problem, but because he changed the way we look at one. In the cafe, the radio static softened. Elias sat motionless. Mrs. Vega touched his shoulder. Is that you they're talking about? He smiled faintly. I think so. She wiped her eyes. Then drink your coffee, genius. Elias laughed softly, the sound trembling with disbelief. The men at the corner table raised their mugs. To the well digger, one said. Elias blushed. No, I just... But the words failed him. He looked out through the window at the pale desert sky. For the first time, it didn't feel empty. At Caltech, the applause began quietly. One pair of hands, then two, then dozens. Not the polite rhythm of academia, something warmer, older. Hoffman bowed his head slightly, then added one last line. Some of you may ask whether this model will stand the test of time. I don't know. But I know this. It came from truth. And truth, like water, remembers its source. He looked down at the wooden board. Then, in a gesture that no one in the room would forget, he picked up a piece of chalk and wrote beneath the sketch, "The Moreno Function, Original Conception." He underlined it once, firmly. Far away in the desert, Elias closed his eyes. He didn't see applause or lights. He saw his mother, her hands, cracked and gentle, pouring water into a small cup. He saw Clara, her pencil tracing circles on old paper. He saw the well, still dry, but somehow, now, full. He whispered to the empty air, "Maybe water doesn't just hold. Maybe it remembers love." That night, Professor Hoffman stayed in the hall long after everyone left. He cleaned the chalkboard himself, leaving only one line untouched, the one with Elias's name. He whispered toward it like a prayer, "May you never be erased." Summer came hard to Arizona. The air grew heavier, the wells grew thinner, and the sky above Ajo turned into one wide white silence. Elias had begun working fewer hours at the garage. The owner told him kindly, "You should rest your hands, Professor," and laughed, not realizing it wasn't a joke anymore. Because, in a way, the name had started to spread. After the symposium, someone had uploaded Professor Hoffman's talk to the university archive. A few clips found their way online. A soft-spoken man holding a wooden board, a chalk line reading "Collapse Without Breaking," and Hoffman's voice saying, "His name is Elías Moreno. He listens to water." That was all it took. Within a month, letters began to arrive at the small post office in Ajo, envelopes from across the country, some from overseas. Most addressed only to Elías Moreno, the well. The clerk, amused, started stacking them in a box by the counter. The first letter was from a student in Ohio. "Dear Mr. Moreno, I watched your model. It reminded me of my father, who was a fisherman. He used to say, 'You can't fight the tide, but you can row with it.' I think that's what your equations mean. Thank you for showing me math can sound like home." L.R. Elias read it 3 times, then placed it gently beside his coffee cup. The second was from India. The third, from Brazil. Some written in careful English, others in words he could only half understand, but all carried the same tone: warmth, gratitude, curiosity. "Dear sir," one said, "you made me believe poor people can think about the universe." Another simply wrote, "I'm learning because of you." At night, Clara helped him open them. She'd sit cross-legged on the floor, peeling stamps with fascination. "Do you know all these people?" she asked. He smiled. "No, but maybe we drink from the same well." He kept the letters in a wooden box beside his notebook. When the wind came through the trailer walls, they rustled softly, like paper leaves in an invisible forest. By late July, the heat became brutal. The ground cracked. The town rationed water. At the well behind his trailer, Elias tried to draw a bucket, but it came up nearly dry. The handle scraped. The rope burned his palm. He sat back, sweating, breathing hard. For the first time in years, he felt the sharp sting of helplessness again, the same kind that had pressed on his chest the night his mother died. He whispered, "Not now. Please, not again." The desert answered with silence. That evening he received a call from Hoffman. "Elias." The professor's voice was faint through static. "How are you holding up?" "We're rationing," Elias said quietly. "Water's scarce again." Hoffman sighed. "You could come here, you know." "I meant it. We can arrange housing, classes, Clara too." Elias looked out at the dark horizon. "And the people here? Who teaches them?" There was a pause. Then Hoffman said, "You've already done enough." Elias shook his head slowly. "When a well runs dry, you don't walk away. You dig." The next day, he started gathering children in the shade of an abandoned shack. Clara helped him set up a whiteboard. He began teaching. Not advanced physics, not formal math, just what he knew. Shapes of motion, patterns of rain, the beauty of a line that holds. He drew waves and curves, told them stories of how rivers remember their paths. "The same rules that guide the stars," he said softly, "guide the dust beneath your feet. We are all made of flow." The children listened, wide-eyed. Some took notes on torn cereal boxes. Others just closed their eyes and imagined. The drought worsened. The local paper wrote about wells failing. Aid trucks came with bottled water. Elias helped distribute them. He lifted crates, carried gallons. His back ached. His hands blistered again. But at night, after everyone slept, he still wrote. One line from his new notebook read, "Even dry air moves with intention. It is not nothing. It is waiting." He realized that maybe turbulence wasn't just about motion. It was also about patience. Maybe stillness was a kind of strength. A month later, Hoffman sent another letter. It contained a single photo. It showed the wooden board, Elias's board, now framed behind glass at Caltech, mounted beside a plaque that read, "Original Moreno Diagram, 2025. A reminder that genius may live anywhere." And below that, handwritten in chalk, "Water remembers." Elias ran his fingers over the picture, then smiled. Small, tired, proud. He showed it to Clara. She whispered, "Mom would be happy." He nodded. "She is." When the wind rose that night, carrying dust across the empty yards, Elias sat at the well again. He held one of the letters from his box, from a student in Poland who had written, "Sometimes, when I can't understand the math, I think of your line, collapse without breaking, and I keep going." He folded it back carefully and placed it beside the others. He whispered to himself, "Maybe that's all learning is, continuing, even when the well is dry." As dawn crept across the horizon, he looked toward the east and thought of Hoffman, of the lecture halls, of the chalkboards glowing under morning light. He wasn't there, but somehow he was everywhere inside it. Because ideas, once released, never really die. They just find new rivers. That morning, he began writing a new note to send back to Caltech. It was short, no equations, no diagrams. "Dear Professor, you once told me mathematics can be a kind of grace. I think you were right, but grace isn't given. It's shared. So I'll keep teaching here until the wells fill again. Tell them at the university the desert is listening. Elias." He placed it in an envelope, sealed it with dust still on his hands, and smiled. It began with a sound he hadn't heard in years, the slow, hesitant tapping of rain against tin. Elias woke before dawn. His body was thin now, his breath shallow, but his mind was clear as ever. He sat up on the narrow cot, listening. Tap, tap, tap. Outside, the desert was trembling with it, the first rain of the season, soft as forgiveness. He smiled and whispered, "About time." Clara burst in moments later, soaked and radiant. "Papa, it's raining," she cried, laughing. "Real rain." He reached out, brushing her wet hair back. "It remembered," he said. "What remembered?" "The sky," he answered. "The promise it made." The years had not been easy. The drought had eaten half the wells, half the crops, half the hope. But the small classroom beneath the shack had endured. Children still came, older now, bringing their younger siblings. Elias no longer stood to teach. His legs were weak. But he sat on an old stool and spoke softly while Clara drew for him on the board. He called the lessons the language of motion. No equations anymore, just stories. He told them how rivers never truly vanish, how clouds are old water reborn. He told them that every movement, even pain, has continuity, that nothing disappears without leaving shape behind. He was teaching life as mathematics, and the children understood. That morning, when the rain began, the whole village ran to the open wells. Elias came slowly, leaning on Clara's arm. The air was thick with the scent of wet dust, that perfume of beginnings. People stood around the old well he had dug years ago, the one that had gone dry. Now, at last, they saw water rising inside, clear, trembling, alive. A ripple formed at its center. Someone gasped. It wasn't just water. It was swirling. Not randomly, but in a perfect spiral. The same pattern Elias had once drawn in chalk a lifetime ago. Clara turned to him, eyes wide. "It's your model," she whispered. "The flow that holds." Elias smiled faintly. "No, my love. It's the world remembering itself." The rain strengthened. Children began to dance barefoot in the mud. Laughter mixed with thunder. Even the elders forgot their dignity for a moment and raised their faces to the sky. Elias sat beside the well, breathing in the scent of wet earth. Drops clung to his eyelashes. He looked into the rising water and saw, reflected there, not his own face, but 100 others. Faces of students he'd never met. Letters he'd once read aloud. The fisherman's daughter from Ohio, the student from Poland, and of course, Hoffman, smiling behind a veil of rain. They were all there, somewhere in the pattern. He whispered, "Every equation is just a memory trying to stay alive." That evening, Clara helped him back to the trailer. He was shivering slightly. "You should rest, Papa." He nodded, lowering himself onto the cot. Rain drummed steady on the roof, like fingers keeping time. "Do you remember," he said softly, "the night we couldn't find water?" She smiled sadly. "I remember you said the desert would learn to listen." He chuckled weakly. "Seems it did." On the small table beside his bed lay his final notebook. The cover was cracked, pages warped from humidity. He reached for it, opened to the last page, and began to write. Slowly, each word deliberate. When water returns, it carries names we've forgotten. When motion rests, it is not death, only the pause before another form. If someone finds these words, tell them turbulence was never the enemy. It was the teacher. He paused, breathing shallowly. Clara knelt beside him. "Papa," she whispered, "should I call Dr. Ruiz?" He shook his head. "No. Just stay." They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the rain. Sometime before dawn, the storm faded. The desert was quiet again, filled with a sweetness it hadn't known in years. When Clara woke, her father's hand was still warm in hers, but his chest had gone still. The notebook lay open on the table. A single unfinished line trailed off mid-sentence. The flow never. She touched the page gently, then whispered, "Continues." The funeral was small. Neighbors, children, a few strangers who had traveled from far away. Professor Hoffman couldn't come. His health had also faded, but he sent a letter that Clara read aloud beside the well. He gave us a new way to see turbulence, not as chaos, but as persistence. He believed the world bends before it breaks, and that wisdom is not owned by universities, but by hearts brave enough to listen. He was my teacher, too. E. Hoffman. When she finished, no one spoke. Only the wind moved, soft, circular, like breath. Years passed. The drought did not return. The little classroom grew into a real one. 4 walls, a roof, a sign that read, "Elías Moreno Community School for All Who Wish to Learn." Children came from miles away, some barefoot, some shy, and Clara taught them just as her father had, with chalk and water and stories. On the first day of every season, she read one line from his notebook aloud. "Smoothness is not perfection. Smoothness is continuity." The children would repeat it softly as if reciting a secret prayer. Sometimes, when it rained, Clara walked alone to the old well. The water there always swirled in the same quiet spiral, never violent, never still. A motion that held. She would kneel, touch the surface, and whisper, "Thank you for remembering." And in the ripples that followed, she liked to think her father answered. Far away, in laboratories and lecture halls, scientists still debated the details of the Hoffman-Moreno model. They argued over proofs, constants, limits. But sometimes, between the arguments, someone would pause and say softly, "Do you know the story behind it?" And the room would quiet. Because every theorem has a soul, and this one began in the hands of a man who once dug wells for his mother and ended in the heart of a daughter who kept the water flowing. Final note found in Elias's last notebook. Water remembers. So does love. And perhaps in the end, they are the same thing.